When I was a kid, I loved fairies. But secondary to fairies was just anything miniature. Any creature that was small. For example, I loved the picture book series Brambly Hedge about little mice living in trees. And so it's not surprising that another thing I loved was the Don Bluth movie Thumbelina. Here's my childhood DVD copy for reference. And this movie, based on the Hans Christian Andersen story of the same name, is about a miniature girl named Thumbelina, named such because she is the size of a human thumb, which for me is like 2 inches. And Thumbelina's whole thing is that she's small and gets into lots of adventures brought about by her size. Like at one point, and this is just a passing moment in the movie, she almost gets baked into a pie, which I had a fear of the oven until I was like a teenager. So for me, that was very frightening as a prospect. Now, if you want to bake something without a girl in it, amazing transition, you may be interested in the sponsor of today's video, Wild Grain. Wild Grain, my besties, they send me bread in the mail. Wild Grain is the first Bake from Frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, artisanal pastries, and fresh pastas. Delivered frozen right to your door. They partner with small bakers across the country to bring you artisanal foods. Everything is super easy, it bakes in 25 minutes or less, and everything bakes from frozen. So you can have fresh baked bread in half an hour without waiting for anything to thaw or making any kind of mess. Your box is customizable, and you can choose between plant-based, gluten-free, seasonal, and limited items. And with every box ordered, Wild Grain donates 2 meals to a nonprofit of your choice at no extra cost. I love their breads, like the slow fermented olive oil ciabatta. It's really good to dip in stew or soup, but you can also just slather it in butter and just eat the bread. Their croissants are delicious and they also smell amazing. And because I'm a chocolate chip cookie girl, I love the giant chocolate chunk cookies. Just be careful with those because they are not kidding about them being giant. They might bump into each other as they're baking. If you want to check out Wild Grain, use my link in the description and use my code SarahSaraf to get $30 off your first order, plus free croissants for life. Thank you, Wild Grain. So our story starts with Don Bluth. Arguably, it starts with Hans Christian Andersen, but the way I'm telling it, it starts with Don Bluth. Don Bluth is an American animator. He started his career working at Disney back in the 1950s. But then he left to start his own studio in 1979, and they made movies like Secret of Nim and The Land Before Time. And in 1994, they made Thumbelina. Thumbelina was one of the last features to be made by Don Bluth Productions as a studio. They shut down in 1955. Don Bluth then went on to work at Fox Animation Studios. So if you know the movie Anastasia from him, that was made by him, but not at his own studio. It was made at Fox. The movies made by Don Bluth Studios had sort of mixed box office success. And by that I mean they did increasingly worse as the studio went on, to the point where in 1992 they had filed for bankruptcy protection. The studio was then acquired in a joint venture by Merlin Films and Media Assets for $14 million. And so then these investors evaluated what Don Bluth Studios had going on, which the studio had 3 films currently in production in 1992. A Troll in Central Park, The Pebble and the Penguin, and Thumbelina. So these investors then spent an additional $6 million to finish Thumbelina and A Troll in Central Park. But they wanted Thumbelina to be released first, probably because it seemed the most marketable. Which, speaking of movies that are marketable, let's check in on Disney at this time. They were in the middle of what is now known as the Disney Renaissance. They were having an amazing run of films that all made oodles of money. 1989, they released The Little Mermaid. 1991, Beauty and the Beast. And 1992, Aladdin. So Don Bluth and his investors may have been thinking, can we also have an extremely successful animated movie, please? Which Thumbelina is in some ways pretty similar to those Disney movies. It is a musical adaptation of a fairy tale, a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, which is the same as The Little Mermaid. And while Thumbelina isn't a princess, she does kind of have Disney princess energy. Don Bluth says in his autobiography, Somewhere Out There, that he was inspired to do an adaptation of Thumbelina because of the 1952 movie musical Hans Christian Andersen. starring Danny Kaye as a fictionalized version of the writer. And we are now going to go on a 1952 Hans Christian Andersen tangent because I accidentally watched most of it. I admittedly skipped ahead a little bit through some of the boring parts. In this movie, Hans Christian Andersen, played by Danny Kaye, is a storyteller and a cobbler with an orphan apprentice. And he tells stories to the children in the town, which, because this is a musical, these stories are depicted as songs. And the stories are referencing actual Hans Christian Andersen stories. But then, Hans Christian Andersen is driven out of town because he keeps distracting the children from their studies, encouraging too much imagination. So Hans and his little orphan boy go to Copenhagen. This movie is Danish in name only. No one has accents, nothing is accurate. It's all on these sound stages that look fine, I guess. But I believe the Danish people were not super happy about this film because of how inaccurate it is. When Hans gets to Copenhagen, he's basically immediately arrested for disrespecting the king's statue. And then while he's in the jail cell, he sees a little girl outside of the jail and he sings a song about Thumbelina to sort of entertain her. Thumbelina dance, Thumbelina sing. When I decided I was doing a video about the Don Bluth Thumbelina, my mom sang that little thing and was like, that's the only thing I remember from that movie. And I was like, I don't think that's in the Don Bluth movie. And now I've figured out it's in the Hans Christian Andersen movie. Anyway, so meanwhile, the orphan, who is not in jail, is able to get Hans hired as a cobbler for the ballet. And while he's there, Hans pretty much immediately falls in love with the lead ballerina, but it turns out that she is married to the choreographer of the ballet. And they have this very fiery, passionate relationship. A lot of the time when we see them, they seem very in love, but while actual ballet stuff is going on, he's very cruel to her in his role as a choreographer. And at one point backstage, they have this big fight, which Hans overhears, where the choreographer is quite mean to the ballet dancer about her dancing, and they both slap each other, and she cries, and Hans is like, these two people should not be together. And the little orphan boy is like, but they're married, like, you don't understand. They seemed very in love before the fight. And Hans is like, you don't get it, child. And so Hans writes the ballerina a love story in the form of the story The Little Mermaid, meant to communicate that she's with the wrong person. And through accidental orphan boy shenanigans, the ballerina ends up with this letter. Hans maybe wasn't going to give it to her, but now she has it. Unexpected result of this, the ballet is now going to produce a ballet based on The Little Mermaid. Also, there's a storyline where Hans makes up the story of the ugly duckling to cheer up this child who had to have his head shaved, and then he's able to get the ugly duckling published in the newspaper. So now he's proud of himself for being a real writer. And then on the opening night of the Little Mermaid ballet, Hans shows up to the ballet and he's trying to deliver slippers to the ballerina. But then the choreographer ends up locking him in a closet to keep him out of the way. Then the next morning, the choreographer remembers that he locked Hans in this closet. And so the ballerina sends someone to go get Hans. And then Hans professes his love for the ballerina. And she's like, ooh, no, I am not into you like that. I'm into my husband, the choreographer. And she very kindly rejects Hans. She's like, it doesn't matter why you wrote The Little Mermaid, meaning it doesn't matter that it was a love letter to me. It's still very beautiful, even though I'm not into you like that. And so then Hans and the orphan boy return home, and Hans continues telling stories to children. The end. It's an odd movie. Thematically, kind of strange. Because the choreographer does lock a man in a closet and is cruel to his wife, but he's played very charming, and it's not really framed as though he's bad. And it's interesting that Hans and the ballerina don't end up together at the end, because I was expecting this kind of movie they would. But that's not what's happening. We are saying, I think, the choreographer and the ballerina are good together. Most of the time we see them on screen, they are very in love. But I wouldn't say that it's a super healthy relationship. And so I guess the message is that the little orphan boy was right, and you don't get involved when married people slap each other. I don't know. But I watched that movie, and so now you have to know about it. Because when else am I going to get to talk about it? So Don Bluth was inspired by that, I guess. And he was like, yeah, Thumbelina's great. I should make a Thumbelina movie. Which I don't know if that's my primary takeaway from the movie, but I guess that's why he's an animator of children's films, and I'm not. And Don Bluth wanted this to be a love conquers all story. So let's see what he came up with. The movie starts with the opening credits in Paris. It's not relevant to the story that we're in Paris. I think maybe we just wanted Paris because it's the city of love, and this is a story about love. But then we meet a little French bird named Jacquemus, and he sings us a song about how you can do impossible things when you follow your heart. That's kind of the theme of the movie. We wanted to get it out of the way real early. Jacquemus lists off some love stories. Oh, Samson and Delilah. Oh, impossible. Romeo and Juliet. Oh, it was impossible, no? You're like, well, yeah. I mean, both of those ended bad. So I would argue that they were kind of an impossible love story. Because they didn't end up together at the end. There's a lot of death in those stories, in fact. I would say those are bad examples of love conquering the impossible. But apparently the most impossible love story of all is that of Thumbelina. There was a lonely woman who wanted a child, and so a good witch gave her a barley corn. And she planted that barley corn, and it grew into a flower. A weirdly wrinkly flower. And the flower opens to Thumbelina, who is not a child, but a fully grown young adult woman wearing clothes, already able to speak. I feel like that's not what most people want when they want a child. If someone wanted a child and you were like, I can't do that, but I can give you a very small woman, I don't think most people would be thrilled with that. But Thumbelina's mom is thrilled to have her and names her Thumbelina. Then we get another song. Thumbelina's mother lives on a farm, and so this song is sung by the farm animals. Who is the girl no bigger than a bumblebee? Thumbelina. The music for this movie is written by Barry Manilow. I don't know very much about Barry Manilow. I believe he is a man who made cheesy music in the 80s. And this is not a video about Barry Manilow, so I did not feel the need to really look into that further. The lyrics are by Bruce Sussman and Jack Feldman. And I will just say that the musical team for Thumbelina is no Alan Menken and Howard Ashman. In my opinion, not even really close. But in this song, we hear Thumbelina sing. And Thumbelina is played by Jodi Benson, who played Ariel in The Little Mermaid. And timeline-wise, Don Bluth did cast her after The Little Mermaid. He was like, get me that lady.
That was the hardest voice to cast in the whole picture. Because when you picture somebody that's only as tall as your thumb, that's 2 inches. She's born at 16, comes out of a flower, actually. She has no experience, no childhood, nothing to refer to, and she has to now face this giant world, nobody her own size. So she's completely isolated. We said, well, what kind of a voice is that? It's not a thin, tiny little voice, but it is a delicate and a very vulnerable sound. I listened to hundreds of tapes to try and find the voice. And so many women's voices nowadays are lower in sound, you know, and they're very confident sounding. Nothing that sounds delicate and like, you know, I need to learn something. So we thought, how are we going to do this? I went to Jodi because I had heard her do the part of Ariel, the Little Mermaid. And I said, Jodi, do you have another voice sort of swimming around in your head that you maybe could pull out for us? She said, yeah, let me try something. And so she gave us some sounds and everything, and it was perfect, just perfect. But it was a long hunt. It took me a couple of months to find this.
Then Thumbelina's mother reads her some fairy tales, and Thumbelina wants a story about people her size. And so her mom shows her some fairies. And Thumbelina fantasizes about meeting her true love, who's the same size as her. Because at this point, she's kind of convinced that she's the only person her size in the whole world. And so then, we cut to some fairies. We see the fairy king and queen flying with their court, doing what I believe they call the changing of the colors. They're basically changing summer into autumn. They're making all the leaves golden. But their rebellious teen son, Cornelius, is nowhere to be found. He's supposed to be behind them, riding in a carriage, driven by a white butterfly. And the dad is like, well, that maybe doesn't leave the best impression on the young ladies, implying that his son is emasculated by this butterfly. And then we see Cornelius, who is flying around on a bumblebee, and he flies by Thumbelina's window. And he's like, wow, I gotta check this out. And he goes in and introduces himself. She's initially kind of afraid of him and a little bit apprehensive, but she warms to him very quickly. And then outside, The bumblebee buzzes. And Cornelius is like, that's Busby, my bumble. He doesn't like staying in one place too long. And Thumbelina's like, well, why didn't you say so? And they go out and take Busby for a ride. Busby is kind of motorcycle coated. Cornelius holds onto his antenna like handlebars. And then we get a song while Thumbelina and Cornelius are riding around. And this feels very inspired by the magic carpet ride in Aladdin. This song sounds like the first draft of A Whole New World. And while they're flying around in this legally distinct bumblebee ride, a boat full of frogs sees Thumbelina. Cornelius takes Thumbelina home, but then he has to go, and he admits that he's the prince, and his parents, the king and queen, are calling for him. But he promises to come back tomorrow. And then we get this close-up on Thumbelina, which is meant to look like dreamy and pretty, but I think her eyes look a little unnerving. But then one of the frogs comes to steal Thumbelina in the night. There's a brief scuffle with the useless household dog, but then ultimately Thumbelina is taken by this frog. Cornelius shows up the next day and he's like, where's Thumbelina? The dog barks at him and Cornelius is able to understand him. And so he now knows that Thumbelina was taken by a frog. Weirdly, every other animal in this movie is able to speak in English that we can understand, but not this dog, but we can still communicate with this dog, which is an odd choice. So Cornelius goes to rescue Thumbelina. Then we cut to Thumbelina on the frog boat, and we meet the Lady Toad and her 3 sons. And they want Thumbelina to join their music act, the Singers España, and they sing a song. The Lady Toad is played by Charo, and she is a very voluptuous frog. Apparently Don Bluth cast Charo and then tried to draw a toad, but couldn't really manage it, so then he ended up just drawing Charo as a toad.
Which came first, Charo or the character?
In the original Hans Christian Andersen version, there is a Mrs. Toad. So we said, why don't we give it some more interest? Let's make the Mrs. Toad maybe Spanish. She has 3 sons. They're singers like gypsies. They travel around all of Europe on some kind of a houseboat, and they sing and entertain. And so they got more rich in personality. When I said Spanish, I thought of Charo. I'd worked with her one other time, and she's just one of the most entertaining personalities to be around, and she's just the sweetest lady, too. So I went to Charo and I said, look, I feel almost ashamed asking you to play the part of a toad, but would you mind? And she laughed and she said, I am a toad, Don, don't worry about it. So she came up with this sound, but I was then faced with going back to the shop and taking that gorgeous voice and her personality and drawing a toad, and I couldn't do it. So I kept drawing Charo. So what you will see in the movie is a glamorous toad, which really doesn't exist, that acts like Charo.
Very out of place character design for this fantasy movie. Then the frogs say, I realize I'm using frog and toad interchangeably. The movie does that. I understand that they are not the same thing. Any amphibian heads in the comments do not need to tell me that. The frogs say that Thumbelina is going to marry one of the 3 frog sons whose name is Grundle. And so then they leave to go get the frog priest to officiate this wedding. And they leave her stranded on a lily pad. Then Jacquimo the bird shows up and he's like, Madame, what is going on? And Thumbelina explains her whole romance with Cornelius and getting kidnapped by frogs and now being stranded on this lily pad. And she wants to get off this lily pad, but that's impossible. But we know how Jacquimo feels about the word impossible. So he goes and yanks the lily pad loose, which, not to be pedantic, but that is not getting her off of the lily pad. That's just moving the lily pad. She's still stranded on the river, and now she's floating downstream towards a waterfall, because of course. This bird is pretty useless. He is bigger than Thumbelina and can fly, so you would think that Thumbelina could get on the bird, but this never really occurs to either of them. Instead, he just tries to yank the lily pad, but then somehow he ends up in the water and he can't swim. So a bunch of fish and bugs manage to drag the lily pad and get Jacquimo and Thumbelina on shore to safety. So now we've accomplished step 1 of getting off of the lily pad. Now Thumbelina wants to get back home. And Jacquimo is like, you just have to follow your heart, which is not directions. I would appreciate maybe a compass, star chart, maybe MapQuest. But instead, she's just gonna walk in whatever direction. All of the bugs sing encouragingly. There's also some chickadees doing the can-can, and they sort of sing her on her way. I forced my mom to watch this movie with me, and she said this part reminded her of Sending Dorothy Down the Yellow Brick Road and all the munchkins singing. So Thumbelina is going to try and find her way home via her heart, and meanwhile, Jacquimo is going to try and find the Vale of the Fairies where Cornelius lives. He's going to bring him to Thumbelina, which is a weird plan because he doesn't know where Cornelius is. And once he leaves Thumbelina and she starts wandering around, he will then not know where Thumbelina is. And so his plan is to try and reunite two people without knowing where either of them are. But to be fair, that is about the level we're dealing with this bird. Meanwhile, we check up on Cornelius. He has returned to his parents in the Vale of Fairies and says that he's going to go find Thumbelina and to try and delay the winter frost as much as they can. And his parents are like, we can only delay the frost a day, which we just made it autumn yesterday because they were making it autumn while Cornelius was meeting Thumbelina, which was last night. So it's been autumn for a day, and we're gonna do winter in one more day. Maybe seasons only feel like a day when you're that doesn't make sense. I got nothing, sorry. I mean, I feel like if anything, if you're really small, the seasons would feel longer than they feel to a human, not shorter. And we're not saying this is how long the seasons feel, we're saying that they actually are a day. It doesn't matter, I'm sorry. We check back in on the frogs. Grundle, the frog who was betrothed to Thumbelina, is being made fun of by his frog brothers for losing Thumbelina. And so now he is determined to go and find her and bring her back and marry her. So Cornelius and the frog are looking for Thumbelina. Thumbelina is looking for Cornelius and also her house. And Jacquimo is looking for Cornelius. And then a beetle, played by Gilbert Gottfried, shows up in Thumbelina's path. And he's very gross and keeps like kissing her. But he's heard through Forest Scuttlebutt that she has a great voice, and so he asks her to sing for him. She asks the beetle to fly her up to the top of a tree so that then she can see if she's walking the right direction to get to her house. But the beetle, of course, does not want Thumbelina to return home, so he's like, that's a big ask. And they make a bargain that he will do that for her if she sings at his beetle ball. This is now the second animal entertainment act that we have run across in this forest. We go to the beetle ball, and Thumbelina is dressed up like a beetle. It's very Bob Mackie. And then we get a beetle musical number. But in this musical number, Gilbert Gottfried is singing, not Thumbelina, even though the whole point was to get Thumbelina to come and sing at this beetle ball. And now I have to listen to Gilbert Gottfried sing. She's just kind of there as eye candy, I guess. All the beetles seem to think she's real hot. But then, as she's dancing, her beetle costume flies off of her. And everyone turns on her immediately. They're like, oh my god, she's so ugly. She's hideous. And so then Thumbelina is kicked out. Because she is so hideous. Meanwhile, some of the little bugs who helped Thumbelina earlier, they were referred to as the jitterbugs. They're like our little munchkins. They see that Thumbelina was captured by this beetle, or like coerced by this beetle. And so they run to go get help. But they're stopped by the frog. And one of them tells the frog that Thumbelina was taken by the beetle. Thumbelina is now stranded out in the forest after being kicked out of the beetle ball. And Jacquimo shows up and gives her a little pep talk. She's like, everything is terrible, and also apparently I'm ugly. And Jacquimo is like, does Cornelius think you are ugly? She's like, no, he thinks I'm beautiful. Ah, so you are. I have to admit that I did watch this movie quite a bit as a kid. I don't remember that, though. I mean, I have the DVD, and my mom says that I did. But mostly what I remember about this movie is the Nostalgia Chick episode about Thumbelina. Lindsay Ellis and Nostalgia Chick were a big influence on me when I was in middle school. And so it's very hard for me to not hear, but if you did not have the boyfriend thinking that you are hot, your ugly dog face would break the mirror. Which is a line from her review. Then the frog finds the beetle, and the beetle's like, I don't have her, sorry. But the frog is threatening to beat the beetle up. And so the beetle suggests a plan where the frog kidnaps Prince Cornelius and uses him as bait to get Thumbelina to come to him. Which I don't understand how that helps you find Thumbelina. If you don't know where Thumbelina is, you don't know where she is to set the trap. Because she doesn't know where Cornelius is. So no one knows where anybody is. And I don't understand how this bait is going to help anyone find anyone else. Because now, instead of spending time trying to find Thumbelina, they're going to spend time trying to find Prince Cornelius. Which I guess for our purposes buys Thumbelina more time. And so maybe plot-wise, that's why we're doing it that way. But the frog and the beetle are not very good evil masterminds. The frog thinks this plan is a good idea, but he doesn't want to do it. So he sends the beetle off to do it. And he rips off the beetle's wings as collateral. Which is not how wings work. I don't think you could just put them back on. Meanwhile, Jacquimo is trying to find the fairies. He asks a fox and a rabbit who are chasing each other, and he asks a hibernating bear. This is all very, like, Looney Tunes, like animal slapstick humor. It's not very good, and it feels like we're just trying to use up time. But somehow, throughout this process, Jacquimo ends up with a thorn in his wing. And then winter comes. Right now, immediately. Everything freezes. We check in on Cornelius, who's flying around on Busby looking for Thumbelina, and then he falls into some water, which then instantly freezes because it's winter right now. But pretty quickly after that, the beetle and his cronies find frozen Cornelius because of the whole Cornelius bait plan, and they cut Cornelius out. Meanwhile, we check on Thumbelina, who is cold and sad and maybe gonna freeze to death, and we hear Thumbelina's mother singing a sad song about someone trying to find Thumbelina. We're at a real low point. But then, luckily, Thumbelina is taken in by a field mouse, and she's taken into this underground tunnel where the field mouse lives. Mrs. Field Mouse is played by Carol Channing. Apparently, originally, Betty White was hired to play this role, but Don Bluth thought that her performance lacked energy. And he had very limited time because the voice recording was going on in America, but because of financial incentives, the animation studio was based in Ireland, and he had to go back home, so he just quickly replaced Betty White with Carol Channing. Now, unfortunately, Carol Channing and Betty White were friends. And so they were talking on the phone and they were like, I just recorded the part of a field mouse for an animated movie. And they were like, that's a weird coincidence that we both did that. And then Betty White was not happy. But Mrs. Field Mouse knows all of the forest gossip. She knows that Thumbelina was engaged to Cornelius, and also that Cornelius was found stone cold dead in the snow. And Thumbelina is shocked and distraught. But then Mrs. Field Mouse says that they have to take corn cakes to Mr. Mole. Mr. Mole is a wealthy mole who lives further down in the tunnel. He has a lot of coins and jewels, and he hates the world above ground. Mr. Mole is played by John Hurt, and Don Bluth said about him, "When John spoke his lines, Mr. Mole transformed into a golden-tongued negotiator, an opportunist, a used car salesman, and a lawyer all rolled into one. John's take nearly knocked me over." Which, this is unrelated. I could have mentioned this at many points throughout the movie, but apparently this is where I took the note for it. Thumbelina's skirt rides up a lot in this movie. Like, at this point, she twirls in front of Mr. Mole, and her skirt goes all the way up to her, like, upper thigh. It happens constantly. There's so much leg in this movie. It's really weird. Especially because Thumbelina is always kind of being sexualized by all of these woodland creatures. And she has this sort of naive, born yesterday vibe. But yeah, lots of Thumbelina leg. Then Thumbelina is made to tell Mr. Mole a story. And she sings a sad story about the sun dying and winter killing everything. And Mr. Mole, of course, is like, "That's great. I hate the sun." Then Mr. Mole is like, "I have something of my own to show you. I found a dead bird in my tunnel." And of course, the bird is Jacquimo, who is not actually dead, like he still has a heartbeat, but he is very cold and unconscious and fell into some sort of hole that took him to this underground tunnel. While Thumbelina is crying over Jacquimo, Mr. Mole asks Mrs. Field Mouse to set him up with Thumbelina, and Mrs. Field Mouse is going to get a cut of money for setting them up. Meanwhile, with our frog and beetle duo, the beetle has figured out that Thumbelina is with Mr. Mole, and so the frog drags the beetle, and the two of them are going to go down to Mr. Mole to go and get Thumbelina. And as he's being dragged, the beetle is like, "Why don't you marry a toad? You find a nice toad with warts and you marry her. It's not a very good Gilbert Gottfried. But that is a great point. Why are we so interested in these interspecies romances with this poor, small human woman? It seems like most of the animals in the forest think Thumbelina is a real smoke show, but then some of them, like the beetles, think she's really ugly. But it seems like generally everyone, regardless of species, is really into Thumbelina, which you'd think they'd all have different beauty standards. Meanwhile, the jitterbugs have found Cornelius, and they're going to make a fire to melt him out of the ice block. Because Cornelius is frozen in the ice block and Thumbelina's down with the mole, Cornelius has kind of been forgotten by our antagonists, which is good for us because he can now be freed. Then the field mouse sings a song trying to convince Thumbelina to marry the mole. Don't marry for love, marry for money, 'cause love won't pay the mortgage or put porridge in your bowl. Dearie, marry the mole. This song won a Razzie that year for Worst Song. I don't know what the other contenders were, but I'm tempted to agree. After being told to marry the mole, Thumbelina goes to check on Jacquimo, and she's talking to the unconscious Jacquimo and sort of updating him, and over the course of her basically talking to herself, she decides that she is going to marry the mole because Cornelius is dead. But then Jacquimo wakes up because she has adequately warmed him. She's able to take the thorn out of his wing, and then he's like, get on my back, we can go find the Veil of the Fairies together, because I guess he still hadn't found it by the time he fell unconscious from the cold. And Thumbelina keeps trying to explain to him that Cornelius is dead, but the way she's phrasing it, Jacquimo thinks that Cornelius is just lost, like he's gone, not gone. And so Jacquimo flies away to try and find the Veil of Fairies by himself. Then it's time for Thumbelina to get married to the mole. We turned around this wedding real fast. Thumbelina is wearing an old-timey court dress with like a neck ruff, and she has this wild hairstyle. It's like these pigtails that are kind of bubble braids, I guess, and they're standing out from the sides of her head. She's walking down the aisle and keeps getting flashbacks of Cornelius. And so finally, at the last possible second, she backs out of the wedding and says she can't marry the mole because she doesn't love him. But at that moment, the frog and the beetle crash in, and the frog also wants to marry Thumbelina. And so now, everyone is chasing her. Also at this moment, Cornelius is freed from the ice, and he shows up at the wedding. But he shows up behind Thumbelina, like Thumbelina had a head start running away, and he shows up amongst all the other animals. So she doesn't see him, but he does end up fighting with the frog and the beetle. And then during this fight, he and the frog fall over a ledge. I'm unclear on the architecture of this tunnel, because this is the mole and the field mouse's tunnel, but the walkway is like a raised platform, and then there's like a giant endless pit on either side, which I don't know why the cavern would be shaped like that. Meanwhile, Thumbelina is running through this tunnel, and she's able to see a sliver of the sun, and so she climbs up this pile of jewels to reach it, and she sends the jewels in like an avalanche behind her. She like knocks down the pile, so it crashes into all the animals who are chasing her, and she makes it out of the tunnel back above ground. She is then reunited with Jacquimo, and she finally gets on his back, and they fly to the Veil of the Fairies, which he has found now. They make it to the Veil of the Fairies, but at first glance it looks normal, just like a normal patch of grass. But to uncover it, Thumbelina has to sing. I don't know how Jacquimo knows that this is how this works. But she sings, and snow starts to melt, and flowers start to bloom. But then Thumbelina gets discouraged, despite the very obvious magic happening, and she's like, it's impossible. But then Cornelius shows up, and they kiss, and he proposes, and Thumbelina sprouts wings. 'Cause I guess now she's the fairy princess, is always how I interpreted it. And then Thumbelina and Cornelius have this very psychedelic wedding back near the house. So Thumbelina's mom is there. We don't get to see them reunite, but her mom knows that she isn't dead. The end. So this is a bit of a hodgepodge of a movie, I would say. Has some sort of odd theming, because it's meant to be about following your heart and doing the impossible. Thumbelina never really has much agency to do that. She's carried, often quite literally, through this story, from antagonist to antagonist. I would argue that both the original Hans Christian Andersen story and maybe less intentionally this story are sort of metaphorically about being small, to talk about being a young woman in the world. Once she's away from home, she is basically completely powerless. She's constantly being exploited and taken advantage of. Everyone is super predatory and uncomfortable towards her, which that is the vibe of the Hans Christian Andersen story, except that it's even more lonely, because the Hans Christian Andersen version doesn't have reoccurring characters. A character will show up and then leave the story, never to be seen again. So that version feels even more empty and hopeless, which is kind of true of all of Hans Christian Andersen's stories. In the movie, Thumbelina complains about things being impossible, and like, I get it. She's so small and vulnerable. Everything sucks for like most of the story. And then the fact that Thumbelina is always in dicey situations is not helped by the fact that the movie itself is not very good. Like, it's a very flawed product. The things that are happening to Thumbelina are bad, and the execution of it is also bad. I was watching it with my mom, and she was just constantly bringing up the fact that she couldn't believe that it came out in 1994. After all of those other Disney movies. She was like, if you told me this was from the 70s, I would have believed you. We have these very hokey side characters. The humor basically never lands. The music is not very catchy or memorable. The movie makes changes to the original story, which I think make it work better as a 3-act structure movie narrative versus a sort of rambly fairy tale. For example, the movie introduces the bird and the fairy prince way earlier and has them continuously show up as like reoccurring characters. In the fairy tale, the first time we see the bird is when it's dead in a tunnel, and the first time we see the fairy prince is at the very, very end when the bird flies Thumbelina away from the mole marriage. So I think the story did a good job bringing them in way earlier. The frog and the beetle are also made to be recurring antagonists. In the fairy tale, when Thumbelina leaves them, they're never seen again. And the movie has a much bigger, more dramatic climax, which makes it feel a lot more cinematic. So I can appreciate that they did make changes to the script and adaptational changes that made it stronger as a movie, but I feel like they could have made way more changes, you know? Disney's adaptation of The Little Mermaid, also a Hans Christian Andersen story, is an extremely loose adaptation. If you know, you know. Edgelords love to be like, did you know in the original Little Mermaid, she dies at the end? It's like, yeah, that and 1,000 other changes, right? For Thumbelina, I think you could have written a whole new plot and basically no one would have noticed or cared. But weirdly, this movie is quite faithful to the original story, which is why I didn't recap the original fairy tale for you, because I thought it would have been repetitive and boring to do both. Obviously, the original fairy tale doesn't have, like, funny Spanish frogs, but in terms of story beats, it's very similar, which is an interesting choice. They made a lot of interesting choices. I don't know if any of them were the right choices, especially because the movie flopped. The movie earned a worldwide box office of $16 million on a budget of $28 million. Whoops. Which, I looked it up, and for reference, Beauty and the Beast had a budget of $25 million, less than Thumbelina, and made $450 million and was Oscar nominated for Best Picture. So, you know, yes, Don Bluth Studios had filed for bankruptcy, but I don't think this was necessarily a budget problem. People love to hate on Disney. I do it too, of course. But in terms of story, music, aesthetic, they are often just very strong, especially compared to some of their competitors. When Thumbelina came out, they did a small amount of merch. This is just something I was personally interested in. There were some small dolls and figures by the company Blue Box. They did Thumbelina and Cornelius and a lot of the side characters, which is fun. There were also dolls and figures by Dakin. They did some Thumbelina dolls, specifically a wedding Thumbelina that I saw listed a lot. There were also these hideous Bendums figures, which have like bendable limbs. There was a Thumbelina board game, where you are trying to get the characters to the wedding. Seems like just Candyland. There was also Thumbelina Halloween costumes, which I think is very cute. If you were alive in the 90s, please tell me if you remember anyone dressing up as Thumbelina for Halloween. And then, I guess this doesn't exactly count as movie merch, but there's a lot of animation cells and signed art available online if you're interested. And if I could complain for a second, there's a lot of stuff for this movie online. And like everybody puts in their listing that it's rare. This doll is not rare. If there's 24 of them on eBay, that's not a rare doll. I have rare dolls in my wish list you couldn't even conceive of. Dolls that barely even exist. But if you are a Thumbelina fan or have a Thumbelina fan in your life, there's a lot of non-rare stuff on the internet you can buy. And then in the long arc of history, I think we can pretty safely say that Don Bluth lost. His production company closed, and then later, Fox was acquired by Disney, so now Disney owns his whole catalog, and Thumbelina is now streaming on Disney+. The ultimate defeat. But that is the story of Don Bluth's Thumbelina. A big thank you to my patrons. A special shout out to Court, Austin Poston, and Melanie Mermaid. If you didn't know, I have a Patreon where I post monthly bonus content. It's just another way to support me. Absolutely no pressure. I'm Sarah Seraph on all social media. And as always, all the sources I used will be linked in the description. And I don't know how to end a YouTube video. So, bye!